Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
She was prettier than I had seen her in years. She was happier. There was a glow about her. And that's sad that your outside world was so terrifying that going to prison brought you happiness. When you're in that situation, you don't see it as violent. It's just Tuesday. It's just Wednesday. How can anybody function, especially in a so dysfunctional home, on all this medication? They were doctor shopping. If my mom was alive, she said it would have killed a horse, as many drugs as she was on. That's her life, is going to be prison.
I'm Sarah Fensky. When Betty Frizzell's sister was charged with murder, it upended Betty's life. But in some ways, it was also part of a familiar, troubling pattern for the former Missouri police chief. Betty Frizzell grew up just outside Poplar Bluff, and as she writes in the first chapter of her recent memoir, quote, "Vicki isn't the first person in my family to be charged with murder. Murder is generational in my family. The Frizzells were known for two things, musical talent and quick tempers. Mom would describe her kin as the kind of people who would rather shoot you than look at you." Betty Frizzell's memoir is about her family's intimacy with violence, but it's also about the opioid crisis that devastated small-town America, about mental illness, and about the ways life in rural Missouri has become impossible for many of its residents. The book is called If You Can't Quit Crying, You Can't Come Here No More. It came out last year from Farrell House Publishing, and Betty Frizzell joins us today to talk about it. Betty, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Betty, you start your book with your sister, Vicki, being charged with the murder of her own husband. How did you get the news?
I hadn't heard from her all day, which was very unusual. She usually calls numerous times because she had had a stroke a year prior to this. So she had gotten to be more childlike and very clingy and called a lot. So there was something unusual when she didn't call at 10 o'clock at night. So I called, and her son had told me that she was in jail for murder.
So that's quite a way to get that news. He says, Mom murdered Chris, or Mom said she murdered Chris. And this Chris was at the time her husband?
Yes.
So Vicki and Chris lived in Puxico, Missouri. Tell us just a bit about life in Puxico.
It's a tiny town. It's about 800 people. It has one marshal. It looks like it's almost frozen in time in rural southeast Missouri, which a lot of those little towns litter all over the Boot Hill. And it's just a very small town. Everyone knows everyone, and there's just generations of people that stay there.
And Vicki had a stroke in 2012, but on top of that, she had a pretty serious opioid addiction. How did that affect her and Chris?
Well, they had both been wrestlers, and when I say wrestlers, I'm saying like the WWE type wrestlers, and both of them had injuries from that, especially Chris, and they had gone to this pain management centers, which were popping up all over rural the rural counties in Missouri, and they were taking these opioids to medicate other things like her mental illness and the pain. And she kept telling me, these are prescribed pills. This is a doctor that prescribed them. But I knew from my time in law enforcement what a rabbit hole that can be, what a person can fall into.
And part of what you deal with in this book is also how Vicky and Chris were paying for the opioids they used. This is an entire community. For the most part, people are subsisting on disability checks.
Right. There's a large number of people who get Social Security disability in that area, and once they get, then they can get on the Medicaid system, and they would use that to go to these doctors. And sometimes they were doctor shopping, or they were selling some of their pills to get through the month before they got their next Social Security check.
So this became a really bad situation with Vicky, with Chris, and then Vicky's grown son also ends up moving into this trailer with them. Just a lot of violence in this relationship. Were you aware at the time of all the domestic abuse that was taking place?
I was aware of some of it, especially after the stroke. She'd gotten more open with telling me. And because she knows that I'm in law enforcement, I was in a mandated reporter, so I would tell, I got a hold of local law enforcement, and and I also opened up a case with Missouri Department of Aging for the abuse that she was suffering, because I knew before the stroke she thought she could manage it, but then you brought in another person with mental health conditions, which was Kenny, her adult son, and then coupled with not being able to have any type of rehab after the stroke. So it was just a perfect storm of violence, because there was uncontrolled emotions, plus the opioids were making her turn into somebody I didn't really know. When I saw the report that her attorney had after her arrest of how many drugs she had in her system and how many she was actually prescribed, it was a laundry list. I couldn't believe it. It was there. How can anybody function, especially in a dysfunctional home, on all this medication?
And you tried to get people to intervene. You say you felt you were a mandatory reporter. You wanted to stop the domestic violence that Vicky was dealing with from Chris, her husband, also from her son. In any case, was anybody able to do anything or willing to do anything to intervene in this very toxic situation?
Well, you take the marshal at the time in the town that I kept talking to, that I wasn't calling just as just a citizen. I was calling as officer to officer courtesy. Like, hey, I know I've been there. I've dealt with these types of situations. It's a reoccurring thing, and you go over there, and neither one of them say that there's anything going on. However, he's elected, and Vicky's alleged victim was the youngest of 8. So those are votes. So they want to, if you want to stay in your job, you know who to arrest and who not to. That's just a typical thing in small towns, because
you feel like they showed favoritism to her husband because he was from a big family where there were a lot of them in that town.
Yes, and like his sister was a well-known social worker. The brother-in-law was the principal of the high school. And Vicky had no voice. She didn't have a name or anything. And I felt like that he was like, oh, well, this is just a family issue, which we know domestic violence is too big. Even in my own family, I tried to educate my siblings, because I'm the youngest of 8. Vicky's the 7th of the eight of us. And a lot of them were like, no, they can handle it. No, they couldn't. And so my husband and I, we actually tried to get conservatorship, which has been a big buzzword with the whole thing that's going on with Britney Spears lately. But people don't understand how hard it is to get conservatorship of someone, especially when they're married.
That I can see how that would be very complicated legally. But so you did what you could. You tried to get people to intervene. Unfortunately, this situation still ended up in a tragedy where your sister's husband was shot and killed. Your sister ended up being charged for it, and you became convinced that she didn't do it, and you explore that in great detail in this book. But what was shocking to me is that even if she did do it, that the court and the people involved in this didn't seem to take into account the long history of domestic violence in this relationship. They were not interested in the mitigating factors here.
Right, and the mental illness, the mental health conditions that both of them suffered from, the laundry list of drugs that she was on. If my mom was alive, she said it would have killed a horse, as many drugs as she was on. And just, taking in effect our family history, Vicky was a person of diminished intellect to begin with, and and just the whole history that she had of the abuse, starting as a small child. And I always see Vicky as, she was born to be a victim because, mom was her first abuser. Then the school system, which used corporal punishment, was her second victim and her second abuser. And then as she got older and got in the criminal justice system, and she was getting abused there because she had issues that were being dealt with corrections sentences, instead of like, let's see what the root of this is. Let's get you into therapy and try to find out why you're this person, which we do all the time in the criminal justice system. There wasn't a mental health court, and Missouri is lacking in a lot of mental health courts. I'm glad there is some in the bigger cities, but in the rural part, there's nothing.
And your sister, it's so clear your sister is failed along the way by every step of the system. Anybody who could have helped her. You got into law enforcement because, you thought this was something where you could help people. Seeing what happened to your sister as this case plays out, and as frankly her whole life played out, did you lose faith in that system?
I did somewhat, because I'm exposed to a different type of policing out here and where I live at now.
You're now living in Washington, the state of Washington.
Yeah. Seattle's much different, and but I think we have the greatest criminal justice system. I think that voices can be heard, but there's so much room for improvement that we've seen. And especially in the state of Missouri, when there's evidence that someone didn't do something, you still want to keep them in the crime, and the Attorney General of Missouri still fights to keep them in prison. There's a problem there. And because what I would teach my students when I was a professor is that the role of the prosecutor is to zealously pursue justice. What is justice doing when you've got a mentally ill woman with an IQ lower than what most people would equate Forrest Gump's as being?
And Betty, are you still there? I think, unfortunately, we may have just lost Betty's connection. We're going to try to get her back. She might still be with us. Betty, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. Sorry about that. I don't know. We're having some technical difficulties. So you're saying that what you see in Washington gives you faith in the system, but what you saw in rural Missouri, it feels like this is a system that doesn't work.
Well, you got to think of at the time I was teaching in North St. Louis off of Goodfellow. So I was teaching policing and criminal justice. So I was dealing with young African Americans in my classroom during the day, trying to help them learn what their rights were and how to get into the system to try to change the system that we have, because we need diversity, and diversity always brings better ideas because people can learn off of other people's ideas. And then I was dealing with rural Missouri at night with my sister's case, so I was juxtaposed between both of those things that were going on.
So your book, we're talking today to Betty Frizzell. She's a former Missouri police chief, currently works as an investigator for the state of Washington. Her book is If You Can't Quit Crying, You Can't Come Here No More. I think this might have been the saddest part of the book, is the part where the title of this book comes from. This is something your sister says to you when you're visiting her in prison.
This is the first thing she said, because in our family, we were conditioned not to cry. We're country Missouri girls. We don't cry. We hunt. We fish. We're strong. But something about seeing her so desperate and so vulnerable in a system that I know what happens when people go to prison. I know how people can get abused, and I know what goes on. I couldn't quit crying.
And she kind of told you, hey, you got to toughen up here, because this was just the life as she knew it. Yeah.
She said, basically she's told me, I made my bed, I'm going to lie in it. That's what Mom used to tell us all the time. And I usually don't get so emotional about talking about her, but I just got off the phone with her yesterday, so. It was pretty hard. Here I've done some pretty tough cases. I've worked in some pretty rough areas in Missouri, and just seeing this vulnerable person, when you're a police officer, you just think, okay, I did my job, I go home at night. But you've actually changed somebody's life course. And that's what I think police officers need to realize a lot more than what we do, that we can go home to our nice warm bed and eat our nice food and everything, but when you arrest somebody or you sentence somebody to life plus 25 years, that's her life is going to be prison. She's not eligible for parole till 2048.
Now, the irony of this, and it seems pretty clear in this book, this is an unjust sentence, again, regardless of whether or not she did it. And you make a good case, she's not even the one who did it. But in some ways, your sister seemed to thrive in prison. In some ways, was that a better environment for her than all the chaos and the violence that she was suffering in Puxico?
And that was the saddest part for me, is just to realize that first time I saw her in prison, when she was actually in Chillicothe, she was prettier than I had seen her in years. She was happier. There was a glow about her. And that's sad that your outside world was so terrifying that going to prison brought you happiness.
And is it because she was able to get off drugs, or also just somebody wasn't beating her?
I think a combination of the two. I mean, she had to go cold turkey off these opioids, which, you can still get drugs in jail. Well, don't kid ourselves. We know that. But for the most part, she didn't have, unlimited access to going to these doctors who, as long as you had the money, they were writing the scripts for her.
So, Betty, your book is grim in so many ways, and I think it's an important book to read. It's eye-opening in terms of what is happening in rural Missouri. And yet the note of hope in this book is that you made it out. You're the youngest of this very dysfunctional family. You're a survivor. Do you feel some pride in that you managed to get out of this mess?
I don't know, because I didn't know anything but the mess. That's all I knew. If it wasn't for teachers and the sense of community that I had that rallied around me when I was very young, and said that this is not your manifest destiny. You can do what you need to do. I think that I didn't, because I didn't know it was so violent until I got out and seen how other people live. Church was a refuge for me. School was a refuge for me. And just seeing how other people lived, because when you're in that situation, you don't see it as violent. It's just Tuesday. It's just Wednesday. I didn't understand how much of post-traumatic stress disorder I had till I got older.
Do you feel like you had to move out of Missouri, even though you had this successful career in Missouri? You had to move to Washington State just to get away from this legacy, get away from this violence?
Yes. This, I wanted to end the transgenerational trauma, and with my son, and but I just felt like just getting, because I would have stayed in it all the time, because that's what I am. I'm an investigator. I stay in trying to figure out something and trying to right wrongs. And I had to move, across country. And it also obliterated my 26-year marriage, this case did. It just couldn't withstand it. After getting help and getting therapy and getting using self-care, because I never knew what self-care was, I just I wasn't the person I was married to. I wasn't that person, and my husband and I both realized that. But, after 26 years of finally getting healthy and figuring out that I needed this move.
You needed this move. You made that move. You got out. It sounds like you're doing great today. You were able to write this book. I really want to encourage people. This is a close-up look at what it's like to grow up in a very dysfunctional family in rural Missouri, make it out, and then still have to deal with family members left behind, doing what you can for those family members, even while you're trying to preserve yourself. I feel like this is a book many people can relate to. Betty Frizzell, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Betty's book is If You Can't Quit Crying, You Can't Come Here No More. You can find your copy from Amazon, or if you choose to avoid Amazon, Feral House Publishing. We have a link on our website. They are the publisher of this book, stlonair.show.
Today's episode was produced by Sarah Fensky, with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.